Any discussion about the windows of Saint Helena begins with two individuals. Conrad Piquel, who is the artist who made these windows, and Monsignor Owen Rowan, who was the pastor of this church for 50 years, who actually contracted with Conrad Piquel to make them. St. Helena was established as a parish in 1913. This was not the original church. The original church sat over here where the parking lot is now. It was built in 1914. In fact, when Monsignor Rowan came here in 1913, he had only been ordained for 6 or 8 years, I think, at that point. This was his first parish. He would end up staying for 50 years. The construction of this church began in 1939. It was finished in the fall of 1940. The first Mass in this building was said in October of 1940. There were no windows in place at that point. Conrad Piquel distinguished himself at Franz Mayer as a face painter, which is in keeping with what turns out in Munich, especially at Franz Mayer, was a Munich style of stained glass windows, which included elaborate artistry and composition. Windows became more like paintings with the Munich pictorial style of stained glass window, and Conrad Piquel was extremely good at it. His ability to do face painting, which are the fine black lines that we see in facial features, we see it in drapery, and we see it everywhere. All of the black was painted on those stained glass windows, and Piquel was very good at that. About the time that this parish is exploding in growth, Conrad Piquel in 1928 comes to the United States to visit an uncle, only expected to stay for a year, but decided to stay permanently, and begins his journey as a stained glass window maker from one end of this country to the other. Monsignor Rowan, in his search for an artist to do the windows of this church, he was in Owatonna, Minnesota, at a church called St. Joseph's down there, and was impressed with some small historical medallions that had been added to that church by the original maker of the stained glass windows in that church, which was Conrad Schmidt in Milwaukee. And it turns out that Conrad Piquel had been working for Schmidt in Milwaukee and did those additional windows. Those were the windows that didn't have his name on it, so when Monsignor Rowan saw those windows and admired them and was convinced that that was the artist he would like to see to do these windows, he didn't know that it was Conrad Piquel. Instead of Monsignor Rowan finding Conrad Piquel finds Monsignor Rowan. He comes to the rectory office, comes to the rectory house, and knocks on the door and introduces himself and says that he understands that Monsignor Rowan is looking for an artist to do his windows, and explains that he would be that person. Monsignor Rowan is not impressed. He doesn't know that he happens to be the artist that did the windows in Owatonna that he admired so much, and is dismissive of him. The legend of the story goes is that at the end of their conversation, Monsignor Rowan mentions that the windows that he admires and likes and the artist that he's looking for did some windows, did some small historical medallions in the windows of St. Joseph's in Owatonna, and Conrad Piquel can happily say that he did those windows. Conrad Piquel offered to do one window, 20 feet tall, 4 feet wide. It would be this window that we're looking at. That was the first window that Conrad Piquel did sometime in 1946. There is a moment, supposedly, where Monsignor Rowan goes to Milwaukee, Waukesha, I think is where Conrad Piquel's original studio was, and looks at this window and is duly impressed. And on a handshake, they agreed to do the rest of the windows in the church, and over the next 18 months they were all done and delivered one or two at a time and established and they were all finished by 1947. The salvation story documented in the windows at Saint Helena begins here in the choir loft with the rose window, which the artist Conrad Piquel entitled the Annunciation window. In the center is Gabriel announcing, obviously, to Mary that she will bear a son. It says down at the bottom, there's text, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." His announcement at the top, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Mary on the right, the Holy Spirit symbolized by the dove above her head. There are angels in the lunettes on the outside, the perimeter of the window, all of them with different musical instruments. And then in 6 different tiny lunettes around Mary and Gabriel are symbols of Mary, starting at the top, the fleur-de-lis, a symbol of love and peace, and the crescent moon. Just above Mary's head, a star on the right, the flowering rod of Jesse to the lower right of Mary, the apple of the fall below Mary, a rose to the left, and above that, a rose to the left, and a snowflake, another symbol of purity. There are 4 different things to look at in this window, but we're going to identify 3 narratives that will trace all the way around the church. There is a central narrative, which is the obvious reason for these windows, the life of Christ. It's the largest portion of all 12 windows around the church, and it begins in this window with the Nativity. If you look 2/3 of the way up, about 2/3 of that window, we see Mary in the center holding the baby Jesus, shepherds on the left, Joseph on the right, the angel above them, the lamb below them, and the ox and ass representing his burden and his sacrificial life to the right of the picture there. It's outlined boldly in red. That represents the beginning of the first narrative that will go in order around the church. Below Mary, we'll talk about something that isn't part of the narrative, which is in 4 windows on this side and 4 windows on the other. That's the prophet Isaiah. We can barely see his name to the right. He's accompanied by what is referred to as iconography, which are those things that look like little flames. In fact, he's holding a piece of burning coal, which is referenced in the story, in Isaiah's story, the purifying coal that burned his lips and purified his prophetic voice. That is not part of the narrative. We can do that first and exclude that. It isn't a story, it's just an isolated picture. There are 4 prophets on this side and 4 doctors on the other side. So we've identified what isn't a narrative. We've identified the main narrative, or the central narrative that goes all the way around. The other 2 narratives that are consistent with all the big windows, at the bottom there is a historical medallion or history medallion. It's included in 8 of the windows around the church. It begins here, and it's not hard to see. It says 1680 on the left, and then on the right it says Father Hennepin. These are all a history of the Catholic Church in North America, some of them locally here with not so much this parish, but with the church in Minnesota in North America. That will be true in all 8 of those history medallions around the church. And at the top, the last of the 3 narratives that are included in this church is not a biblical narrative, but it's certainly a theological narrative. This is related to Saint Helena, the patron saint of this church. There's a 13th century saint book by an archbishop, I think in Milan, called Jacobus Veragine, who wrote a thing called the Golden Legend. And it includes a story about the wood of the cross. That story exists. Conrad Piquel would have known it. I don't know whether he would have known it from stained glass windows that he would have studied in Europe, but he certainly would have known it from fresco and artistry that exists in the Church of the Holy Cross in Florence. There is an elaborate fresco display of much of this story, and in several other churches it exists too. It's not original. Conrad Piquel didn't invent it, but it was a story that existed, and he knew it, and it was the perfect narrative to include in the windows in a church whose patron saint is Saint Helena. It begins, and what we're talking about is the wood of the cross, meaning the wood that would begin here and end up the wood that Christ would be crucified on. The theological part of that story is linking Adam to Christ, which we'll see as it goes around. That narrative begins also in this window. It continues in the top, the arched part of all 12 large windows in the church. The story here, and if we can focus on it clearly, it's usually not impossible to see. We see a dying Adam. He's kind of grayish there. He's prone. He's actually dying. And his still living son, Seth, the third son, has his hand stretched out in front of the tree, which is behind them. Seth has been convinced or told by St. Michael, where Adam sent him looking for oil to somehow help him, that wasn't possible. But Seth returns with 3 seeds that will be planted under Adam's tongue when he dies, the tree of life or the tree of knowledge behind them. Those seeds will be planted under Adam's tongue when he dies, and a tree will sprout, which we'll see becomes the wood of the cross later. We're confident now that we've seen the 3 narratives, the history medallion, the central medallion, the life of Christ, and the narrative that includes the wood of the cross that will go all the way around the church.